This is the first time I saw Srila Prabhupada in person. When we were waiting at Logan Airport, we were waiting for Prabhupada to arrive, and when we got a first glimpse of him, I was really in awe that he appeared as though he was floating down the exit from the airplane. And he seemed like he was just floating down the hallway with such a glow to him that it was like no other person I ever saw in my life.
When Srila Prabhupada was greeted at airports, he would obviously be surrounded by his loving disciples, and then there would be a much larger group of people in the airport who would just be amazed at the whole spectacle of the flowers, the chanting, the ecstasy, the jumping for joy, and then, of course, the beaming and radiant Srila Prabhupada gliding through the corridors or being surrounded by his disciples covered in garlands. And Srila Prabhupada would note the crowd and quite often encourage the devotees to continue chanting for their benefit. Sometimes the chanting would die down and he would raise his arms, continue. And then finally, he would give a lecture on occasions to the crowd. In Boston, I remember, he looked around and he said, about this greeting, it says in Shastra that the spiritual master should be worshipped on the same level as God. However, if he thinks he is God, he is dog.
Prabhupada was supposed to go to a hotel in downtown Boston for a press conference, and Uddhava, who was my boss at the press, didn't allow me to go to the hotel. Instead, he took me back to the temple. So I was really angry with him that I didn't get a chance to see Prabhupada more, and as we were standing on the porch of the Boston temple, and I'm there kind of under my breath cursing Uddhava, all of a sudden Prabhupada's car drove up, and there was Prabhupada at the temple, and there were probably only about 5 of us there, me and Uddhava, the Pujari, and a couple of others. So we greeted Prabhupada and walked down the hall to Prabhupada's room with him. And in the meantime, I guess devotees figured out or found out that Prabhupada wasn't going to the hotel, so they all converged upon the temple, and we all went to Prabhupada's room. And I couldn't believe that here, first time in my life, I was sitting so close and right before Srila Prabhupada. So during the course of probably about an hour and a half or 2 hours of sitting in Prabhupada's room with him, and of course the crowd grew. There was one devotee in the group, Petit Udaran. He had a brother, Madhu Mangal, and they were 2 of the first initiated devotees from New York. And Prabhupada knew their mother, and Petit Udaran was in the room, and Prabhupada asked him how he was doing, and he asked him about his brother, and then he asked him about his mother. So Petit Udaran said, I want to try to save them, Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, there's one story in this regard. And he said there was a family of sparrows, and young baby sparrow flew out of the nest and got captured by the hunter. And the mother said, oh, my baby, she's gotten captured by the hunter. I'll go to try to save him. And she flew out of the nest, and she got captured by the hunter. And then the father sparrow, he said, oh, my son has gone out of the nest. He's gotten captured by the hunter. My wife has gone out. She's gotten captured by the hunter. He said, if I go out, I'll get captured too. And he flew away and didn't try to save them. So Prabhupada said, the most important thing is that you've got to save yourself, and that's of primary importance.
It was the Boston temple where I finally ended up joining. And the devotees knew that I had spoken with Srila Prabhupada, so they thought that even though I was just a guest, I was an outside devotee, but and I wasn't following so strictly, but still they allowed me to have darshan with Srila Prabhupada. I was introduced a little the wrong way. Srila Prabhupada was told, this is Bhakta Lan. He used to speak with you at 61 2nd Avenue, which was the second temple. And I was never even in that temple. So but I was a little nervous now. I wasn't quite as wild as I was in '66, and also Srila Prabhupada was a little less anonymous in terms of his prestigious and important person that he really was. So I was a little in awe, finally. And instead of correcting and saying, no, it wasn't 61, it was 26 Second Avenue, instead of saying that, I wanted to give Srila Prabhupada some hint about our previous conversations. So I said, Srila Prabhupada, when I used to speak with you in 1966, I was very, very crazy. So I thought this would help Srila Prabhupada remember. So Srila Prabhupada looked at me and raised his eyebrows and said, oh, and are you still crazy? So then the onus was on me to try to prove to Srila Prabhupada that I was not crazy anymore. So I said, no, I'm not crazy anymore. Srila Prabhupada said, so what is your situation? Now what are you doing? And I said, well, now I have a wife, and I have apartment, and I have a truck or 2 trucks, and I have a business. And I was kind of proud, giving a list of things that almost made me normal, to back up my statement that I wasn't crazy. And Srila Prabhupada said, it is okay, you don't have to move in the temple. Different from the instruction he gave me in '66. He said, you stay with your wife, you stay with your business. He said, but I only ask one thing of you. Yes, and just try to understand Krishna. So I thought that was the end of the darshan, and it was actually. So I offered obeisance. I learned how to do that over the years. And as I was walking out the door, Srila Prabhupada said, the last words I personally received from Srila Prabhupada's lotus mouth was something a little enigmatic. He said to me, and we are not asking for any money. And I left.
We set up the ISKCON press in Boston. And after we were set up, Prabhupada came and visited. And I was hand-binding Ishopanishads, Nectar of Devotions. And I remember we did a run of Back to Godheads. I remember hand-cutting 80,000 Back to Godheads. That requires 3 cuts per magazine. So that was quite a load of work. And some of the magazines, if I would load too many in the cutter, they would come out kind of misshapen, but we'd go out and sell them anyways. And next to my folding machine, I folded the papers, and a Dwaita would print. So the printing press was right next to the folder. So Prabhupada came in and saw the folder, and then walked over to the press, and looked at a Dwaita, and looked at everybody in the crowd, and touched the printing press, and he said, "This is my heart." So I feel that my service was much appreciated by Prabhupada, even though we switched from printing and binding to Japan soon thereafterwards. And I feel privileged to have served him in the press capacity in the earliest days.
I remember in the Boston Temple taking a walk with Prabhupada. There was a small park nearby, and as we were walking through the park, at one point I had asked a question. I don't recall the question, but Prabhupada turned and looked at me straight in the eye and said, "When you're reading, understand every word before you go on." And that's always stuck with me. Often when I'm reading now, I say, Prabhupada wanted me to try to understand every word before I continued. But it was quite profound instruction.
At Boston, it was just Jadharani and Satsvarup. Devananda was the one brahmachari that was there. And then there was 4 brahmacharinis, Mijanava, Rukmini, and Saradya. And Satsvarup said to Prabhupada, all these brahmacharinis, they're always fighting with each other. And Prabhupada said, that is because they need to be married. They are fighting. They must get married. Immediately arrange. I will perform wedding before I leave. And he was leaving like 2 days later. So kind of instantly we were supposed to be getting married, and it was pretty shocking. And then this other brahmachari came named Dayal Nitai, and Prabhupada said I should marry Dayal Nitai. And I got really upset. I somehow, did not want to marry Dayal Nitai. I went up to this hill somewhere and was like crying and praying to Krishna and not knowing what to do, thinking that Prabhupada said I should do this, and I just had very strong resistance to it. So I came back down, Satsarup said, what's wrong? And I told him. And so Satsarup went into Prabhupada and said to him, Arundhati's upset. She doesn't really want to marry Dayal Nitai. And Prabhupada said, that is okay. Nothing is by force in Krishna consciousness. And if she doesn't want to marry now, then she can get married at some later date. So I was very relieved. So the next day, Prabhupada performed that wedding ceremony with the 3 couples. And so I was praying to Krishna, please send me a husband. I don't want to, I just felt so uncomfortable. So then, I don't know time exactly, but, whether it was a month or a little bit longer, but Purushottam called out, and he said, Prabhupada would like to know if you would like to come here and marry Pradyumna. And I had met Pradyumna once before, and we were both working on Prabhupada's books. So I thought about it, and I said, okay, I will come. So then I went to Columbus, and Prabhupada married us. And then Prabhupada asked me and Shamadasi if we could do composing of his books. He bought the first composer machine. He was very involved with that and was writing to us quite regularly. And he said we should learn. We went and learned how to use it. And he gave us specific hours. He said, Arundhati, you can work from maybe it was 7 to 10, and Shamadasi 10 to 1, and Arundhati you work again from 1 to 4, and Shamadasi from 4 to 7, so that we are really using the time, and getting the books done. And I think the first book we did on that machine was The Nectar of Devotion. Prabhupada was constantly writing letters and, wanting to know how it was going, and very involved with that.
Just like Krishna spoke to Arjuna, and Jesus Christ spoke to some general the shepherds, which is a status of life and their understanding different. The representative of God speaks according to the circumstances, according to the country. So it was good for the people at that time. They should have concentrated through this stuff.
Is this Krishna consciousness sectarian? Can anyone take it up? Can Christians take it up? Can Muslims take it up?
Yes, you can see practically. All our students here in the Western countries, they are mostly coming from Christian group, Greek group. And there are many Mohammedans also.
I was in New Vrindavan. Things were pretty basic there. A lot of dirt and mud. And my mom sent me this sweater. It was saffron, and of course, we had trouble keeping stuff clean there, so I didn't want to get it dirty. I thought, this would be nice for Prabhupada. It's not going to be much use here. So I put it in a plastic bag, and I was living in a brahmachari ashram, and somehow I was able to protect the sweater from getting dirty for like a couple of months. And then Prabhupada came to Boston to see the press, and we drove up from New Vrindavan. I was all excited to have the sweater that my mom had given me, and I was going to give it to Prabhupada. So we got to Boston, and I think there was an artik, and then Prabhupada went in the back of the temple. They had a curtain. It was closed off to make like a sitting room, and all the big devotees were back there with Prabhupada, and now's my chance, so I barged in and stood there like sort of stammering. Prabhupada, my mom gave me this sweater. She sent it from England, and it's really nice, and I wanted you to have it. Prabhupada said, oh, no, I can't take this. Your mother gave this to you, and you should keep it. So I was crushed, and Prabhupada saw that, and he said, well, all right, we'll exchange. And he had this saffron sweater on with little brown buttons on it. And he unbuttoned the sweater and took it off and gave it to me, and I gave him the sweater. And it was just like a really wonderful exchange. All the devotees in the room were very moved. Everybody was crying. It was very nice. I was clutching the sweater, and I felt blessed to have it. I really held on to it, for days. It didn't leave my hands. I think it's on the altar at New Vrindavan. I gave it to the temple, and as Prabhupada Prasad.